Patients always ask me, what type of pillow should I be using to sleep? So let's talk about it. So here we have a soft pillow, okay? Not very firm, it's not memory foam. This is just your standard $10, $15 pillow you can get from the store. Best way to sleep with this kind of a pillow is going to be flat on your back. And as you can see here, in this position, my head is actually in a more neutral position. It's not lifted up, it's not bent backwards like this. It's in a nice, straight, comfortable position. So this pillow would be appropriate for that. Now, let's say you're a side sleeper. You're going to need to change things a little bit, because here's what happens. Roll over onto your side. If you have a soft pillow, what will happen is your head will actually move into a side bend. So if I come off the pillow, it will actually be bent like this. Sleeping in that position can sometimes irritate neck pain if you already have it. So what you actually want is a more firm pillow. That pillow won't allow your head to sink into it. It'll actually keep your head more level and in a neutral position, which is essentially where you want it. Now, people often say, if you're a stomach sleeper, never do that. It's not always the case. Stomach sleeping, for some people, is actually really good for them, and they just enjoy it, and it's the best way for them to sleep. Here's my recommendation for stomach sleeping, is place the pillow underneath you like this, long ways, shift it off to the side, and then you can actually lay your face kind of at an angle, think 45 degrees toward the ground, and you can hang out in this position. This is an okay position to sleep in because your head is not, if you went the more traditional way on your stomach, completely rotated to the side. If you sleep this way, you'll probably wake up with a kink in your neck. So the recommendation, one more time, turn the pillow long ways, angle it just a little bit, head straight down, and you're not putting that extreme angle on your neck. And then you can actually switch sides every other night if you want to work on that same amount of rotation the other direction. So it'll help you prevent neck problems in the long run.